In 1930, one American company was running 15,737 grocery stores. Say that number out loud and it sounds invented. It isn't. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P to everybody who shopped there, kept a store on a corner in nearly every American town. Its sign was about as remarkable as a mailbox. Picture an ordinary Tuesday morning in a town of 4,000 people. A woman walks past a red storefront with gold lettering and hands a list across a wooden counter. A clerk in a white apron fills it off the shelves behind him. That's where your great-grandmother bought her coffee. The company had roasted that coffee itself in its own plants, then priced it under everything else on the street. But what almost nobody says out loud is where the collapse actually began, and it wasn't in a boardroom. It began in a federal courthouse in Danville, Illinois, in September 1946. That month, the government of the United States convicted the two brothers who ran A&P of a federal crime. The charge, put into plain English, was selling groceries too cheaply. There's one sentence about butter buried in that trial record, and I'll come back to it because it explains almost everything that followed. So here's the question worth the next half hour of your evening. How did the biggest retailer America ever produced shrink from nearly 16,000 stores to none? And why does almost nobody remember it? The counts are all written down, year by year, sitting in the public record like a case file nobody ever opened. The largest store this country ever built is gone, and the memory of it got erased right along with the shelves. The trail starts at 31 Vesey Street in Lower Manhattan in 1859 in a storefront and warehouse that sold tea by mail. The name on the door was George Gilman, a leather merchant's son who'd worked out something simple about the tea trade. Tea reached American shops through a chain of middlemen, and every one of them took a cut. Gilman decided to buy whole cargoes straight off the ship instead. The story goes that he then sold that tea for roughly a third of the corner grocer's price. By 1870, the operation had a grander name, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, borrowed from the railroad ambition of the age. It sold coffee, too, and spices and baking powder, all under its own labels. The second name in this story is George Huntington Hartford. He came in as a clerk around 1861 and worked his way up to cashier by 1866. Company lore has always put him at the founding table in 1859, though the records suggest he arrived a little later. That's the kind of detail a firm quietly rounds off over a century. When Gilman retired in 1878, Hartford ran the place alone. Gilman died in 1901 without leaving a will. Hartford then claimed an unwritten agreement from 1878 that handed him half the company, and he won, and the family took control outright. The growth under him was steady rather than spectacular, 70 stores and $1 million a year by 1878, then 198 stores and $5 million by 1900. Respectable and nothing that would frighten anybody, which is roughly when one of his sons walked into the office with an idea the whole family hated. If you like the stories America filed away and forgot, this channel is where they get pulled back out. Subscribe and stay for the courtroom part. The son was John Augustine Hartford, born in 1872. By 1912, he'd spent years watching the grocery trade spend money on things customers had never asked for. Every grocer in America ran credit accounts and delivered to the door. Most handed out premiums on top of that, and they all paid for it with a markup of about 22%. John proposed a store with none of it. No credit, no delivery, no premiums, one man behind the counter, and a markup of 12% instead of 22%. His father and his older brother thought the idea was reckless. They let him try exactly one on the condition that he keep it cheap. He put about $3,000 into a bare little shop in Jersey City, New Jersey. Then he did something faintly wicked. He opened it around the corner from an existing A&P and let the two of them fight it out. The economy store, as he called it, took the older store's customers inside a few weeks, which settled the argument nicely. Think of it the way you'd think of a stripped-down car. Same engine, same destination, none of the chrome, and a price that undercuts everything on the lot. Customers, as it turned out, wanted the price far more than they wanted the chrome. So the company began stamping out economy stores like coins. There were 585 stores in 1913 and 1,600 by 1915. That made A&P the largest grocer in the country before the First World War had finished. By 1920, it was past 4,500. Now run that play another decade without slowing down. You get a number no retailer on earth had ever posted. In 1929, A&P became the first American retailer to sell $1 billion in 1 year. Every department store and mail-order house in the country was still somewhere behind it. A year later, the store count peaked at 15,737. Roughly a dime out of every dollar Americans spent on groceries crossed an A&P counter, and in some regions, the share ran a great deal higher. Behind the stores sat about 70 factories and more than 100 warehouses. The company baked its own bread and roasted its own coffee rather than buy either from anybody else. That coffee is worth holding on to. The house brand was called 8 O'Clock, sold in a red bag, and by 1930 it was the best-selling coffee in America. Better than a quarter of the national market out of one grocer's own roasting plants. Remember the bag because it comes back at the end of this. To feel the scale, you need the country it sat in. In 1929, America had roughly 585,980 food stores, one for every 51 families. Most of them were a single room run by a single family. Against that, one company with 15,000 stores was less a business than a piece of national infrastructure. And that, in truth, is exactly what made it a dangerous thing to be. A country of small grocers had just watched one outfit take a tenth of the trade, and small grocers vote. But the first real blow didn't come from Washington at all. It came from a middle manager at a rival chain with a typewriter and an idea his own bosses ignored in the year A&P peaked. In 1930, a Kroger employee named Michael Cullen sat down and wrote a letter to his own company's president. He described a store nobody had built yet. Enormous, cash only, no deliveries, parked out on cheap land at the edge of town with room for automobiles. The margins he proposed were so thin they read like a misprint. He asked for permission to try 5 of them. Nobody at Kroger ever answered the letter. So on the 4th of August, 1930, Cullen opened it himself at 171st Street and Jamaica Avenue in Queens, New York. He stocked around 1,000 items. He advertised himself with a phrase no marketing department would sign off on today: the world's greatest price wrecker. What he'd built is the thing we now call a supermarket. And here's the awkward part for A&P. The economy store had been the cheapest way to sell groceries in America for 18 years. Overnight, it was the small, slow, expensive option because Cullen's format did to A&P precisely what A&P had done to the corner grocer. To its enormous credit, the company saw it coming and moved. Through the second half of the 1930s, A&P tore down its own empire on purpose. It closed economy stores by the thousand and put supermarkets up in their place. Between 1936 and 1940, the store count fell by roughly half to a little over 6,000. Over the same stretch, sales went up more than 50%, and by 1939, the chain was running about 1,100 supermarkets. Hold that fact somewhere safe. It's the answer to an objection you're going to want to raise in about 4 minutes. This was never a company that couldn't adapt. It was a company that adapted brilliantly right up until it was told to stop, and the telling started with a congressman from Texas. Wright-Patman and the death sentence Bill Wright-Patman represented a rural Texas district full of independent merchants. He spent the 1930s as the sharpest enemy the chain stores had. In 1936, he got his name on the Robinson-Patman Act. It made it illegal for a manufacturer to sell the same goods cheaper to a big buyer than to a small one. The whole point of it was to take away the volume discounts that let A&P undercut the corner store. He wasn't alone in the mood either. Senator Huey Long had warned a national audience in 1934 about the handful of men he said owned the country. He named the Hartfords out loud when he did it. Then, in 1938, Patman went for the throat. He introduced a national chain store tax of $1,000 a store. Then came the detail that made it lethal. He multiplied the whole bill by the number of states the chain operated in. Applied to AandP's 1937 figures, the tax came to roughly $500 million. That was about 60% of everything the company sold that year, and many times over what it earned. Congress had never before written a tax designed to erase one named company by arithmetic. AandP fought it in the open, buying newspaper advertisements and putting its own customers to work writing letters. The bill never made it out of committee. They'd won, or rather, they'd won that round, and by winning it so loudly, they'd made themselves the most conspicuous target in American commerce. The Justice Department had a quieter instrument sitting on the shelf. It took that one down 4 years later. Here's the objection a sharp viewer is already forming, and it's a fair one. Big old company gets fat and slow, misses the future, dies of natural causes, and the lawsuit is a footnote historians dress up afterwards. That's the tidy version. The trouble with it is the timing. AandP's adaptation record through the 1930s was the best in the industry, and the month it stopped taking risks can be dated exactly. The first indictment came in Dallas in 1942 and got thrown out. The government refiled in 1944 in the Eastern District of Illinois. The trial ran through 1945 and into 1946 in the courthouse at Danville. In the dock sat the company, several of its executives, and the two brothers themselves. George Ludlam Hartford, then 81, who ran the money. John Augustine Hartford, 74, who ran the stores. Judge Walter C. Lindley convicted them and fined each defendant $10,000, which for men of that fortune was a rounding error. The finding underneath the fine carried rather more weight. Lindley held that AandP had used its size to keep prices artificially low. Conduct that led straight to lower prices for the shopper, he ruled, could itself be a restraint of trade. Read that twice because it doesn't get easier the second time. The largest grocer in America was found guilty of charging its customers too little. And here's the butter I promised you. On the stand, John Hartford explained his entire life's work in a single line. He'd rather sell 200 pounds of butter at a penny of profit than 100 pounds at 2 cents. That sentence built 16,000 stores. In an Illinois courtroom, it read as a confession, and the men in Washington were only getting started. Wanted to make the appeal took 3 years, and in 1949, the conviction was upheld. Worse, the government wasn't finished with them. It pressed a civil case with a remedy attached, and the remedy was to break the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company into 7 separate companies. Now put yourself behind that desk for a moment. Every price cut you make is evidence. Every factory, every warehouse, every advantage of scale you spent 90 years assembling is being read in open court as proof of a conspiracy. What would you do? You'd stop. That's what they did, and that decision is where this story quietly changes shape, because this stops being a story about groceries at all. It becomes a story about a company taught by a federal court that its own best instinct was a crime. A company that then spent 30 years being careful. The men who might have argued back ran out of time almost at once. John Hartford died on the 20th of September, 1951, of a heart attack in an elevator at the Chrysler Building, walking out of a board meeting. His brother George held on until 1957 and died at 92. After that, by most accounts, the enormous block of stock the brothers left behind was managed for steady income rather than for growth. The men running the stores took their cue from that, and the fight went out of the place. And yet the country wasn't sitting still. While AandP held its breath, 40 million Americans picked up and moved. The post-war suburb was a different retail problem, and the answer to it was unglamorous. Buy land early, build big, and pave a lot for the cars. Kroger did it. Safeway did it out west in a market A&P had barely bothered to enter at all. A&P had somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 stores in 1950. An awful lot of them were small boxes on downtown corners, on short leases, with no parking to speak of. Perhaps the leases were the real trap. A short lease is cheap and it feels prudent, but it also means you never own the corner. When the corner dies, you've nothing to sell and nowhere to go. By most counts, the company simply refused to pay up for the prime suburban sites while its rivals were bidding hard for them. That's a decision that looks like discipline on a Tuesday and looks like surrender across 20 years. If you've seen the film on this channel about the dead malls, you already know how quickly one missing anchor turns a parking lot into a field. So the counts went sideways instead of up. Roughly 4,500 stores in 1950 and still around 4,000 stores in 1970. The country had nearly doubled what it spent on food in between. Standing still isn't fatal on its own, mind you. What made it fatal was what the company chose to build with the money instead, and it built the wrong thing beautifully. In 1965, A&P opened a food plant at Horseheads in upstate New York for its AandP house brand. It cost about $25 million. It was a superb factory. It was also the answer to a question the 1960s had quietly stopped asking. Vertical integration had been the family weapon since the beginning. Own the roasting and the cannery, and you own your own costs. And yet the decade was running the other way. Television had made national brands enormous, and shoppers now wanted the label they'd seen advertised between the news and the ball game. The chains that were winning had more shelf and better corners, so why keep pouring capital into the back of the business? Because it had worked for 50 years, and because nobody in that building had been rewarded for a risk since 1946. The machinery still ran perfectly. It was simply pointed at the wrong wall. Somewhere in that same decade, A&P stopped being the largest retailer in the United States, a title it had held since before the Great Depression. Nobody in the building seems to have marked the day. Then in 1972, a newer generation of management looked at the ledgers and at the market share bleeding away. They reached for the one weapon the company had been forbidden to use. They decided to compete on price again, and what happened next is the part of this story I'd most like you to remember. They called it WEO, for where economy originates, and they converted somewhere near 3,680 stores to it. Prices were cut across the board. The gross margin fell to roughly 12%, against about 18% for the discount chains it was fighting. 12%. That is, to the decimal, John Hartford's economy store markup from 1912, brought back from the dead 60 years later. Customers came. So did the carnage. Kroger, Grand Union, and Bohack took brutal losses trying to hold the line on price. A&P's own year ended with $6.4 billion of sales and a $51 million loss. The next year clawed back a small profit on higher sales, and then the whole thing sagged again. In March 1975, the board brought in Jonathan Scott, the first outsider ever to run the 116-year-old company. His opening proposal was to shut about a third of the 3,500 stores that were left. So here's the reveal this story has been walking toward since the first minute. WEO was the butter sentence, run at national scale, 26 years after a federal court called it a crime. The company was convicted for the one thing it did better than anybody alive. It spent a generation not doing it. It lost the cost structure that made the trick possible. Then it tried the trick again anyway, with none of the machinery that had once made it work. If that just rearranged how you read the whole century, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I'll keep pulling these files out of the drawer. In 1979, a German retailing family bought control. The Tengelmann Group, run by Erevan Haub, took a majority of A&P's stock, and for a while, the transfusion worked. By 1982, the company was profitable again and trying new formats under names like Future Store and Superfresh. In 1986, it bought Waldbaum's and the Food Emporium. But watch what the count was doing underneath the good news. About 2,000 stores at the start of the 1980s, roughly 1,000 by 1990, around 600 by 2000. Every recovery bought a few good years and cost a few hundred doors. Nobody outside the trade press appeared to notice a national institution halving itself, twice. Then, in 2003, the company sold 8 o'clock coffee to a San Francisco investment firm. 3 years after that, the brand went to Tata, the Indian conglomerate, which owns it to this day. So read that sequence slowly. The red bag that had been the best-selling coffee in America left the company alive and healthy, a full 12 years before the company died. The brand was worth more without the stores than with them. That's a strange and fairly brutal thing to learn about your own business, and it should have been the loudest warning anybody got. Instead, in 2007, AandP made one last enormous bet. The target was a rival it had been fighting since the 1960s. The rival was Pathmark. In March 2007, AandP agreed to buy it for about $677 million in cash and stock. Counting the debt, the deal ran close to $1.3 billion. The Federal Trade Commission challenged it that November. The two sides settled with store divestitures, and the merger closed in December 2007. Which was, of course, precisely the wrong month of the wrong year to be carrying that much borrowed money. The recession came and the debt stayed. In December 2010, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company filed for Chapter 11 with about 400 stores. It came out in March 2012 as a private company, smaller and quieter, and it lasted 3 more years. In July 2015, it filed again, and this time the filing was a funeral. There were 296 stores and roughly 28,500 people. Acme bought 76 of them. Stop and Shop took 25, Key Food another 23, and the rest were simply switched off. On the 25th of November 2015, the last of them closed. 16,000, then 4,000, then 296, then nothing. It's all in the annual reports printed and filed in public year after year after year, and almost nobody read a page of it. Picture a supermarket coffee aisle on a Saturday morning, right now, anywhere in America. An old man in a windbreaker stops at the shelf and picks up a red bag, and his granddaughter asks what he's smiling at. He tells her his own grandmother bought this coffee. He tells her it used to come from a store with a red sign, and that the letters on the sign were A and P. She asks him what happened to it. He turns the bag over, reads the back of it for a second, and gives her the honest answer, which is that he isn't entirely sure. Then he puts it in the cart because it's good coffee and it's on sale, and the two of them move on toward the checkout. Nothing is owed here, and nothing is returned. 16,000 stores are gone, the coffee's still on the shelf, and the checkout line behind it never once slows down.